Hi, everyone. This is Mary from Mary's Virtual Healthatorium. Today, I am going to talk about the book of Job, which you may find in the Old Testament of the Bible. The book of Job is actually a meditation, and I should have not written why bad things happen to good people. It's more of a meditation in the fact that bad things happen to good people. So the book of Job was always one I didn't like because God and the devil were wagering over a human soul. And to me, that made God a devil. But that's not what the story is about. And I'll get into that in a little bit. It's rather written as an epic poem and a meditation on why bad things happen to good people. The book of Job begins like a dream and turns into a nightmare. And before we enter into the story, there is something else important to understand. The book of Job is not generally treated by biblical scholars as a straightforward historical account. It's more like I said, it was written kind of like an epic poem, and it is a work of ancient wisdom and literature, part story, part poetry, part theological argument, and part meditation. The exact date and history of its composition are debated, and we cannot honestly say that it was the first story ever written in the Bible or even the first biblical story written down. But it was certainly one of the oldest stories that were found that make up what we call the Old Testament. What we can say is that the book of Job, which is amongst the Bible's oldest stories, is also one of its most profound explorations of the question human beings have about why terrible things happen to people who have done nothing wrong to deserve them. And the book of Job does something remarkable. It asks the question, but it refuses to give us an easy answer, and it refuses to give us platitudes. The story begins. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. That word perfect in the King James Version of the Bible means something closer to complete, blameless, or whole. Job is not secretly wicked either. He is not a hypocrite, and he is not being punished for some terrible sin. He is, by the story's own description, a good man, and God blesses him. He has children, he has animals, he has servants, he has land, he has wealth, and he has a reputation. He has everything a person in his world could imagine wanting. And then the scene changes. We are taken into a heavenly court. The sons of God come before the Lord, and among them comes Satan. Here's an important distinction in this story. The Hebrew word Satan means something like the accuser or the adversary. We often use the term adversary to describe Satan, but he's also an accuser of human beings. In the book of Job, this figure is not quite literally fully developed into the devil, this all powerful evil personification that is taught by later Christian theology. Instead, he appears as a member of the heavenly court. He's a prosecutor, someone whose role it is to challenge or to accuse. Jesus, on the other hand, is often referred to as the advocate, whereas Satan is the accuser. God asks Satan, "Hast thou considered my servant Job?" God praises Job, but Satan says, "Doth Job fear God for naught?" In other words, of course Job loves you. Look at all you've given to him. But take away his blessings, Satan argues, and Job will curse God. And so we're set up for the great experiment of Job's soul. But again, I would be very careful about calling this a bet or a wager between God and Satan, because, first of all, it's horrific, the idea, but it also distorts the real point of the story. First of all, I don't think it's in the nature of God to gamble with a human soul. But the story is not there to teach us that God is casual with us and makes wagers with the devil. It is using a dramatic, almost cosmic courtroom scene to ask a much more frightening and pertinent and a question that we actually live in. Can faith survive when every reason for having faith has been stripped away? Job loses everything as a consequence. His animals are stolen and his servants are slaughtered. So, what ends up happening is one horrible thing happens to one of his flocks, and all of his servants are murdered. But there's always one who survives at least long enough to get to Job and tell him what happened. So he loses his camels, he loses his flocks of sheep and other lands and other herds, and he is just bombarded by bad news. One guy comes to him and gives him an item of bad news and collapses at his feet. Another one comes in, same thing happens. The onslaught of bad news is relentless. And then comes the worst news of all. His children are gathered in a house, eating and drinking together, when, as the Bible tells us, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. One disaster arrives before Job can even comprehend the previous one. His world collapses in minutes, and yet Job falls to the ground and says, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And after saying that, he fell silent at first. But Satan is not finished with him. Job's lost everything, but he is still alive. So Satan goes to the Lord and says, "You haven't taken away enough. Touch his body, take his health." And Job is struck with boils from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. He sits in ashes, scraping his wounds with a piece of broken pottery. The man who once had everything now had almost nothing. He even lost his health. Three of his friends come to him: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And at first, they do exactly what good friends should do. They sit with him. They see his suffering. They tear their clothes. They put dust on their heads. And they sit beside him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights. The Bible tells us no one said a word to him. And that may be the wisest thing anyone does in this entire story. They say nothing. They're simply present. They're there for him. And sometimes there is nothing a friend can do for the suffering of someone they love except to just be present and be there. Eventually, Job speaks, and this is where the book of Job becomes extraordinary. He stops being polite. He stops performing obedience. He stops pretending that everything is fine. He curses the day he was born. He cries out. He demands an explanation. And eventually he speaks directly to God, not softly, not reverently, but with anger. Job says, God, I am furious with you. And the paradox here, well, there's two. One is that he's saying, I'm furious with you, but at the same time, I need you. And that in and of itself, that anger and that need in and of itself is an act of faith. Job is still talking to God. He still has a relationship with him. He might be swearing, he might be cursing, yelling, screaming, but it's still a relationship. He could have just walked away. He could say, there is no God. Instead, he asks, where are you? Why have you done this? Why have you abandoned me? Answer me. Again, Job does not want platitudes. He wants an answer from God himself. Now, his friends can't tolerate that. So they begin defending God. They think what Job has done is blasphemy, and they tell Job that God is just and everything he does is right. Therefore, they reason, Job must have done something wrong. Because if Job is suffering, there must be a reason for that. And that reason must be he's being punished. And if he's being punished, well, then he is guilty. So their theology is tidy and it comforts them. But their theology is wrong. They are accusing him of something that he didn't do wrong. And remember what Satan does? He accuses him too. He's not going to love you if you take everything away from him. The entire opening of the story has already told us something that these friends either don't know or they have forgotten, and that is Job has done nothing to deserve this. The friends look at his suffering and say there must be a reason for it. Job looks at his suffering and says, I don't understand. And the story sides with Job because eventually God himself appears, but God does not arrive with a neat explanation. He comes out of the whirlwind. So that must have been a scary appearance. And instead of giving Job a simple answer, God overwhelms him with more questions. Where were you when the foundations of the earth were laid? Can you, Job, command the morning? Can you understand the creatures of the deep? Can you comprehend the architecture of creation? God does not say, here it is, here's the reason you're suffering. God gives Job something stranger, a vision of the universe far larger than Job's ability to comprehend. There are laws at play for which we know nothing about. And then comes one of the most startling moments in the Bible. God turns towards one of Job's friends and says, my wrath is kindled against thee and against thy two friends, for ye have not spoken of me the thing which is right, as my servant Job hath. So think about that. The people who defended God were the ones God rebuked. God didn't need a human being to defend him. The man who shouted at God was the one God called truthful. And why? Because Job was honest with him. He was honest about his anger with him. He had questions and he questioned him. But his friends had certainty. This is perhaps one of the deepest ideas in the entire book. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. Certainty is the opposite of faith. Because with faith, there is not an absence of questions. Faith is what happens when we continue asking in the presence of God, saying, I don't understand anything. Whereas, like his friends were saying, they understood everything. And again, Job doesn't understand everything or anything, but he's still speaking with God. He argues with God. He cries. He demands. And he refuses the easy answer and he refuses platitudes that his friends were giving him. And somehow, Job's relationship with God survives this ordeal. That may be the faith Job ultimately discovers, not the faith of a man who has all the answers, but the faith of a man who lost every answer and still refuses to stop asking. There's a dangerous lesson here for anyone who has suffered. We are often tempted to explain another person's pain, and we don't know the depth of their heart, but we tell them everything happens for a reason. God has a plan. You must have done something wrong, or just have faith. But Job's friends teach us how cruel these answers can become and how wrong they are. Sometimes the most sacred thing we can do is say, I don't know. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is sit in the ashes with someone and say nothing. And sometimes faith sounds less like a hymn and more like a scream. Job's story does eventually end with some restoration. His fortunes are returned, his life continues, but we should be careful with that ending. No restoration can simply erase the death of a child. No new house replaces the old one. No new flocks replace the old flocks. No blessing makes grief and trauma disappear. The point is not that suffering is good because eventually something better comes along or because we have to suffer in order to deserve something good. The point is that Job's suffering cannot be reduced to a simple equation, that equation being good people are blessed, bad people are punished. It doesn't work that way. Life is more mysterious and more complex than that. And God is more mysterious and more complex than that. The book of Job leaves us standing in the whirlwind. It does not give us a formula for suffering. It gives us permission to be human inside that suffering, to grieve, to rage, to question, and to doubt, to pray when prayer feels impossible or like a waste of time, to say, God, I am angry with you, and then somehow to keep talking. Maybe faith wasn't supposed to mean certainty. Maybe faith is not having every answer, but faith is standing in the ashes, looking up into the storm and saying, I don't understand you. I don't understand this. I am furious and I'm afraid, but I'm still here. And that perhaps is where faith lives, not beyond the questions, but inside of them. And that ends my Sunday sermon for today. This meditation in bad things happening to good people found in the story of Job in the New Testament, or I'm sorry, the Old Testament of the Bible. Thank you for listening, and I will catch you next time.